Let me begin, if I may, by describing my book. This is a book about the reciprocal encounter between Eastern European Jews and German culture, concentrating primarily on a small group of avant-garde Yiddish writers working in Berlin during the Weimar Republic, taken in comparison with corresponding figures working in German language literature, critical theory, journalism, and film. Its first part considers Dovid Bergelson, who lived in Berlin from 1921 to 1933, in comparison with the German writer Alfred Döblin. The second part focuses on two narratives by the Yiddish modernist Nister, the hidden one, Pinchas Kahanovich, which bookend his stay in Germany from the years 1921 to 1926. To contextualize Nister's writing and to elaborate on the correspondences between Yiddish and German culture, I consider these two stories in comparison with the early 19th century Hasidic storyteller Reb Nachman of Breslov, Reb Nachman's German language contemporary E.T.A. Hoffmann, and the 1930 German film The Blue Angel, Der Blaue Engel, directed by the Austrian-American filmmaker Josef von Sternberg. The third part of the book examines themes of nostalgia, apocalypse, and the aestheticization of religious concepts in interwar Jewish culture. It begins with the parodically syncretic 1930 German novel Hiob, Job, by Joseph Roth, who traveled from his native Galicia at the border separating the Austro-Hungarian Empire from the Tsarist Pale of Settlement to Vienna, then to Berlin, then to Paris, to work as one of the most successful German language authors during the Weimar Republic. From Roth, the focus turns to the Yiddish author Moisha Kolbach, who lived in Berlin from 1920 to 1924 and produced two of his greatest early achievements there, the 1922 narrative poem Reisen, Belarus, and in 1924, his first prose work, Mashiach ben Ephraim, the Messiah of the House of Ephraim. The three Yiddish authors who provide the primary focus of this comparison, Bergelson, Nister, and Kulbak, are among the most innovative and distinctive members of the Yiddish avant-garde during the era of high modernism. Interpreting their writing through aesthetic categories developed in the Weimar Republic is intended to advertise their centrality to modernist aesthetics, not in spite of their peripheral culture and language, but because I believe it is from the periphery, whether defined in geographic, cultural, or social terms, that modernism articulates its critique of modernity. Because these writers were temporary residents of Berlin, they were peripheral in all three senses of the term I am proposing. And yet their presence in the Weimar Republic is representative of a larger phenomenon of refugees from the East, both Jewish and non-Jewish, seeking reprieve from the political instability and physical dangers of life in regions such as Russia and the former Pale of Settlement following World War I, as well as during the chaos ensuing from the breakup of the Tsarist Empire in the years 1917 to 1922. As Oleg Budnitsky writes of the demographics for these refugees, quote, according to a 1925 census, there were 253,069 former citizens of the Russian Empire, according to the borders of 1914, living in Germany. Only 80,000 of them were ethnic Russians. Of the so-called Russian immigrants, 63,500 were Jews and 59,000 so-called Russian Germans. Budnitsky goes on to state that more than a quarter of all Russian refugees coming to Germany were Jews, and depending on when and who was estimating, somewhere between 25,000 and 90,000 of the 100 to 300,000 Russian refugees in Berlin during the Weimar Republic were Jewish. However, counterintuitively, any study of Weimar's fugitive aesthetics must begin with a consideration of Berlin's relationship to Eastern Europe. This is not only because of the status of Yiddish writers living in Berlin as recent and temporary refugees from the former Tsarist Empire, but also because the Soviet Union was a subject of fascination, fear, and idealization for Germans as much as it was for once and future Soviet citizens, and an ambivalent attraction and anxiety toward the communist society unfolding there registers across the German political spectrum. As books such as Arnold Zweig's 1920 ethnographic essay, Das Ostjiddische Antlitz, The Face of Eastern European Jewry, demonstrate, a vanguard of Jewish, mostly Zionist German intellectuals had begun to take interest in East European Jewish culture before the establishment of the Weimar Republic. But following the October Revolution, both the development of communism in Russia, as well as the influx of Jewish refugees to Berlin, offered new objects of contemplation and new venues for interaction. Joseph Sherman thus describes Dovid Bergelson's involvement in the establishment of one such gathering place for East and West, Berlin's Shalom Aleichem Club. Quote, situated in a large apartment on the Savigny Platz, it soon became popular in Jewish émigré circles for its excellent Ashkenazi cuisine, offering Yiddish speakers a Hamish alternative to the city's other cafes and lessening their sense of social and cultural isolation. It hosted evening lectures, discussions, and charity concerts, at one of which Bergelson and Albert Einstein performed together as violin soloists, end quote. For the Yiddish writers themselves, the eventual and eventually fatal draw back to the Soviet Union, as well as the traumatic circumstances in which they fled their lands of origin, provide an explanation for why Berlin figures only superficially and almost always in negative terms in their work. Indeed, the unfinished psychic and political work left at home prevented the Weimar Yiddishists, as I'm calling them, from feeling settled in their place of refuge. The break these writers had made with their place of origin was too tentative to enable them to commit to life or work in Berlin. As Joseph Sherman documents in his essay on Bergelson, the many Hebrew language authors also active in Berlin during the same era were able to rationalize their sojourn there as a temporary means of financing their imminent relocation to Palestine. The Yiddish writers in Berlin, however, knew that their writing was being produced for export, either back to Eastern Europe or for the American Yiddish press. Yet their location in Berlin provoked the derision of compatriots still in Poland or the Soviet Union, as well as feelings of guilt, betrayal, and illegitimacy among themselves. As Sherman quotes Dan Nister in a letter from 1923, quote, in Berlin, it's a disaster. The Yiddish intelligentsia has been left without roots, and they rot away individually and collectively. Some kind of action is demanded. Summon us to America or to anywhere else you wish, end quote. Now, for both temperamental and political reasons, America was not a viable option for writers such as Kulbak, Bergelson, or Nister. And Poland, by the end of the 1920s, offered even less financial or political security than Berlin did. The pull of the Soviet Union would prove irresistible to each of these writers. Yet what is of greatest interest about their Berlin period is neither the inevitability of their departure from Germany, nor their rationale for returning to the East, but the aesthetic and emotional complexity of what they managed to complete while they were living in Germany. Confusion and ambivalence are what make these Weimar Yiddishists true representatives of their time and place. The influx of East European refugees coincides with a massive population growth and geographical expansion of the Berlin city limits. Along with rapid industrialization and the creation of a consciously modernist architectural style, the radical social transformation from a militaristic, authoritarian empire to a democratic and at times anarchic republic signifies the way in which Germany had become a foreign country for the native born as much as for refugees. The traumas inflicted by economic chaos, at least before the period of stabilization ushered in by the currency reforms of 1923, as well as the presence of crippled, disfigured, and psychologically battered ex-soldiers amplified this estrangement with echoes of defeat, despair, and destruction. Though linguistically foreign and socially other, refugees in Berlin participated in and contributed to a general sense of dislocation attested to throughout interwar German culture among all ideologies. By concentrating on the aesthetic character of the Yiddish literature produced in Weimar Germany, my comparison conceptualizes this social history in formal, aesthetic, literary terms. This study therefore offers a new method in seeing how artistic creation is constructed and of understanding the political resonances that result from these structures. At the heart of this study is the critical theory of Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's ideas relating to the status of the fragment, language, history, and spectacle provide a model for characterizing the aesthetic problems that this study will consider. Moreover, as a participant in Weimar culture, particularly its radical Jewish avant-garde, Benjamin's work provides the ideal source for allowing Berlin modernism to critique itself. His mostly hapless career was in part motivated by the same anxious allure of the Soviet Union that determined the fate of the Yiddish authors in Berlin, of whom he was probably otherwise completely unaware. And though the animating concerns of his work seem removed from the traumatic uprooting of East European Jewry, his preoccupation with a profane mysticism resonates with the poetics of these Yiddish authors. The anticipatory character of his writing, its ability to introduce new perspectives by recalling abandoned technologies and superseded aesthetics, provide a means to connect Weimar culture to contemporary postmodernism, for all the differences between their epoch and ours. Just as Benjamin sees cultural productions as an explanatory model for the relationship of the past to the present, the achievements of Weimar modernism, including Benjamin's work at the time, serve as a resource for understanding the status of contemporary aesthetics, its significance for the future that every era designated by the prefix post maintains. There are three concepts, or in Benjamin's usage, constellations, that recur with specific resonance throughout my work: allegory, the Baroque, and melancholy. Of the three, allegory requires the most detailed explication, in part because the term has attracted such extensive critical debate, in part because the distinctive significance of this concept to the development of Yiddish literature has been so little remarked upon in previous critical sources. Allegory is a trickier term to understand than other representational strategies because it hinges on a double substitution and consequently on a double illusion. Allegory depends on an irreparably unstable relationship between signifier and signified, while at the same time it poses as offering an absolute connection between the terms of an equation that it exposes nonetheless as arbitrary. Indeed, Benjamin offers the most succinct and suggestive definition of allegory when he writes, quote, "that which the allegorical intention is fixed upon is sundered from the customary contexts of life. It is at once shattered and preserved. Allegory holds fast to the ruins. It offers the image of petrified unrest, end quote. Allegory manifests itself as a performance of indeterminacy, masquerading as the imposition of a final and irrefutable truth. Characteristics of allegory nevertheless manifest themselves consistently. Specifically, allegory emerges as a conjunction of concept and image, thought and expression, the verbal and the visual. Allegory, to be clear, is not a genre or even an interpretive technique, so much as a rhetorical effect stranded between polarities of metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor thus functions as a mode of enchantment, endowing the objects of its equations with a capacity for transformation and suggesting an illusion of organic relationship to its poetic constructions. Metonymy likewise establishes a relationship of apparent contingency predicated on the material circumstance of its conjunctions. Allegory, by contrast, is what we would call a mode of consubstantiation, reiterating the indivisibility of the physical and the abstract, and thereby offering an eschatological relationship of objects and concepts nevertheless lacking in transcendence. For this reason, allegorical representations typically stress two features: an iconography characterized by the corpse, the skeleton, the skull, and the muteness of either objects or subjects, the inability of a figure or image to speak for itself. The association of allegory with debilitation, disfigurement, and death makes it an apt strategy for depicting the body in extremis, and therefore accounts for its uses in the portrayal of warfare, madness, and despair. One of the determinant factors for the significance of allegory to the aesthetics of the Weimar period is the legacy of World War I, which in both physical and social terms introduced an unprecedented level of violence against the body and the body politic. In Yiddish literature, one of the great narratives devoted to the destructive impact of the war on traditional Jewish life is Churban Galicia, The Destruction of Galicia, written in 1920 by Shin Ansky, which, beyond its documentary value, offers an array of allegorical strategies for depicting the psychic consequences of the war's violence on Jews caught and displaced in its path. In one episode, Ansky records the testimony of a woman from the town of Denbitze who has taken refuge in the town of Tarnów. After dispassionately describing the disappearance of her children and grandchildren and the bombings and pogroms that befell her hometown, she suddenly breaks her monotone to bewail the desecration of Torah scrolls and the slaughter of horses during this sequence of atrocities. Caught between the physical violence of the pogrom and the mechanized violence of the bombing, the refugee allegorically equates the fate of her children simultaneously, but only implicitly, with the slaughter of helpless animals and the destruction of sacred objects. Her ability to bemoan the fate of horses and Torah scrolls instead of her own offspring affects the reader, not because the loss of these animals or artifacts is commensurate with the murder of her family, but because it is not. The inadequacy of language that allegory enacts is the only form of representation that offers a voice to that which cannot be said. One similarly sees some of the characteristics of allegory at work. in Arnold Zweig's Das Ostjiddische Antlitz, which offers an exemplary illustration of how allegory functions in the works I'm considering, as when he writes of East European Jewish women. Please allow me to share my screen. In the wide eyes of these girls, you see the innocent tranquility, the trusting nature of organic creatures who gladly exchange a word with humans, because humans are created in God's image, and friendliness is their commandment, who withdraw disconcerted and wounded when the Westerner claims that there is an erotic feeling at play here, and then maintains that he is witnessing a kind of cryptic flirtatiousness. Look at these innocent, full lips that are nothing more than childlike, whereas the European, raised on the catchwords of operettas, thinks he is discerning sensuality, anticipating the mass-produced kitsch fantasies to which the Jewish woman is subjected. That racial traits, such as dark eyes and black hair, cannot prevent either soldier or student from wanting to make love to a dusky female Jew, Pole, or Spaniard. Not all girls have the sensitivity of their souls written across their mouths or on their parted lips. Rarely does melancholy stand plainly between the curved eyebrows and the painted oval of their face. In its outline, does not often tremble from alienation so expressively as in these days. Zweig here reads the faces of the young women he encounters, in part because they lack a shared language through which to communicate, but equally because the purpose of his portraiture is to present an ideal composite rather than an individual. From the organic creature that he describes, the author constructs a timeless abstraction, deprived of context and self-definition, that denies her the living presence that he otherwise extols as the natural source of her praiseworthiness. The face serves as an emblem, and not only does Zweig project a sequence of meanings onto it, but these meanings serve as a series of negations. The Jewish woman is virtuous, tranquil, yet vulnerable, because she is not modern, not Western, and not German. Moreover, with these negations, Zweig confers and denies the femininity of the Jewish woman, because her eroticism, which is both present and absent, functions only as a misreading from the Western male, the author himself. Zweig's imposition of a series of moral qualities onto the neutral features of East European Jews that he surveys is hardly unusual among ethnographers, and the conclusions he draws from his own imputations are far more benign than either a great deal of anthropological observance of racial others in his day, or the competing stereotypes about Eastern European Jews among Western Jews as well as non-Jews. What is fundamental to anthropological or ethnographical research of the era, and intrinsically connected to the function of allegory, is the perception of the other as not only culturally, ethnically, or even biologically different, but also as an inhabitant of or a remnant of a bypassed historical dispensation. As Angus Fletcher has written on the historical disconnection between a medieval worldview and the historical circumstances of the Elizabethan era, quote, "One could hardly imagine an English author more addicted to medieval allegory than Edmund Spenser, and yet he conveys a strong sense of current political events and a general historicity colliding with his archaic myths. In that way, Spenser, for all his medieval yearnings and leanings, is a modern, forcing his vast allegory to think more and more about current historical pressures," end quote. One might suggest, in more dialectical terms, that Spenser, like other allegorists of the Renaissance, illustrates the collision of medieval conceptual categories with their newly modern usurpers and despoilers. Allegorical figuration captures the inadequacy of medieval rhetoric to represent the violent upheaval of the newly modern world, in conflict with the inability of this new modernity to generate conceptual models rapidly enough to convey the world onto which the poet has stumbled. The same collision of the obsolescent with the contemporary encapsulates, more than 300 years later, the phenomenon of Yiddish modernists such as Kulbak, Nister, and Bergelson, or, in a separate medium, though the same milieu, Marc Chagall, carrying the vestiges of Jewish observance from the shtetl to an urban encounter with Russian symbolism and German expressionism. On the other side of this dialectic is the phenomenon of German Jewish intellectuals such as Arnold Zweig, Alfred Döblin, Joseph Roth, and especially Walter Benjamin, whose disillusionment with the ostensible rationality and seeming secularity of the modern world, revealed by the upheavals of World War I to be as much of a mystification as the pieties of bygone centuries, led them each to an embrace of various forms of de-ritualized mysticism. In both the Yiddish and the German halves of this comparison, one observes a disenchantment with disenchantment, expressed allegorically as a recourse to visual imagery, teamed with a lack of confidence in the knowledge produced by empirical means, a disillusion of faith in the world observable only through the physical senses. Now, there's much more that could be said about the concept of allegory, a lot more. But by way of introduction, I want to turn now to the concept of the Baroque, both in Benjamin's distinctive usage of the term and my even more expansive adaptation of it here. For Benjamin, the Baroque is an aesthetic practice characterized by a series of contradictions: meticulous ornamentation and ruinous fragmentation, solemnity and failure, splendor and shadows, majesty and melancholy. The central concept that animates his thinking on Baroque aesthetics is the Trauerspiel, roughly the play of mourning, a 17th century dramatic genre that Benjamin examines in its German context. The characteristics of the Trauerspiel include its pageantry and spectacle, its focus on intrigue and the theory of the state, and its preference, in contrast with classical or Renaissance tragedy, for historical or at least legendary settings rather than mythical or supernatural ones. Of greatest significance for Benjamin's study is the repudiation of transcendence in favor of the immanence of corporeality, and the turn common to most Trauerspiele of the tyrant into a martyr, or, correspondingly, of a martyr into a tyrant. These features are a recurring preoccupation of my comparison, which takes the Baroque less as a historical period than as a recurring aesthetic strategy manifesting itself in a series of movements, periods, and genres throughout the modern era: the Gothic, symbolism, expressionism, surrealism, as well as both avant-garde and popular art at the beginning of the 21st century. By recognizing these aesthetic modes as a subterranean genealogy for the aesthetic critique of modernity that develops in opposition to a dominant, though never static, aesthetic of mimetic realism. But I also contend that what mobilizes these anti-mimetic aesthetics of distortion, spectacle, fantasy, allegory is the descent from modern hegemonies, motivated by a dislocation from dominant understandings of time, history, and temporality, the experience of history as time. The perception of belatedness with respect to a dominant mode of representation provokes an aesthetic practice that anticipates subsequent forms of cultural production. This dynamic, I believe, is best illustrated by the development of Yiddish literature. During the heyday of Baroque aesthetics in the late 17th and early 18th century, although there was no shortage of writing in Yiddish, there were essentially no new Yiddish narratives produced in what would today be recognized as belletristic forms. When modern Yiddish literature begins with, among other literary productions, the publication of Reb Nachman of Breslov's stories, their aesthetic character is Baroque in several ways, which I discuss in my book. Reb Nachman's literary activity, only one aspect of his often manic and always remarkable career as a religious thinker and leader, coincides with the birth of a European Romanticism and the heyday of the Gothic novel, cultural developments of which he would have been almost certainly unaware. Yet, the juxtaposition of his Baroque tales with the Gothic novel demonstrates many similarities between these aesthetic discourses. Similarly, the influence of Reb Nachman on subsequent neo-romantic Yiddish authors indicates the proximity of Gothic aesthetics with late 19th century symbolism. By the time one considers Yiddish symbolists such as Der Nister, his work coincides with the era of surrealism and expressionism. Yiddish literature in the interwar context, while participating surreptitiously in the culture of Weimar Germany, also provides an index to a history of anti-mimetic narrative forms in the modern era. Not because Yiddish is identical to the co-territorial literatures it abuts, but because it is often so radically different. By the same token, the characteristics of belatedness and failure to coincide with a temporal framework that insists on synchronicity pertain to our own era, for which the catch-all concept postmodern signifies only that previous social and aesthetic consensuses no longer apply to the present day, even if a new vocabulary or even a new name for our contemporaneity has yet to emerge. The postmodern is Baroque, insofar as the Baroque is proto-modern, combining a pre-modern worldview with the material circumstances of an incompletely understood present. The unsettled feeling of not coinciding with the present moment prompts a longing for bypassed periods, either as a means of connecting to a tradition of continuity and belonging, or alternatively, as a romance of previous eras in which a historical possibility of dynamic change and aesthetic experimentation provides a reproach to a current moment of mechanical, mass-produced, materialist culture. Benjamin associates melancholy with the 17th century Baroque and its cultivation of allegory, but one recognizes that the concept applies with equal pertinence to the Weimar era and especially to the temperament of Benjamin's own writing. Speaking of Charles Baudelaire, Benjamin observes, quote, Baudelaire was a bad philosopher, a good theoretician, but only as a brooder, a gribbler, was he incomparable. Now, this characterization applies as much to Benjamin himself and perhaps to me as well. The attention that Benjamin devotes to the concept of melancholy bypasses Sigmund Freud's symptomatic clinical differentiation of mourning, a seemingly organic process, from melancholy, a neurotic manifestation, to return to the origins of melancholy in medieval theories of the body. What defines melancholy against mourning for Benjamin, unlike Freud, is not a distinction in degree, but a difference in kind. As Elite Ferber explains, quote, the melancholic mourns what he has not yet lost but also what was never his to lose in the first place, end quote. In this respect, I would contend that the relationship to traditional Jewish culture of German Jews, such as Benjamin, Döblin, Arnold Zweig, even Gershom Scholem, is one of melancholy, whereas for Yiddish authors like Bergelson, Nister, and Kolbach, it is one of mourning. To be sure, the loss of tradition is not something that interwar Yiddish or Hebrew writers imagined. It was a trauma they experienced, observing the horrific devastation of their traditional culture, their shtetl culture, that Arnold Zweig apostrophizes. Even if prior to World War I, they had each looked forward to the emancipation that a freedom from tradition had promised. If German Jewish radicals such as Arnold Zweig romanticized Yiddish culture to resist their familial legacy of bourgeois gentility and unreflective German nationalism, Yiddish writers witnessed the destruction of their parents' world firsthand. The distinction between Yiddish mourning and German melancholia accounts for the unaffiliated, abstracted cosmopolitanism through which writers like Benjamin, Döblin, or Joseph Roth expressed their sense of Jewishness, and the explicitly Jewish character of Yiddish authors returning to the Soviet Union, or the disparate Zionist affiliations of Scholem, Arnold Zweig, and the Yiddish and Hebrew poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg. These are the considerations that determine the parameters of my research. Among the Yiddish writers, journalists, and community activists who passed through Berlin during the Weimar Republic, I concentrate on the ones who returned from Germany to the Soviet Union. Among the German Jewish figures who participated in public life in interwar Berlin, I focus primarily on Jews who identified publicly with Jewishness, yet who expressed this Jewishness through the radically cosmopolitan route of what can be considered a permanent exile. The mourning of the Yiddish authors I consider accounts for their decision to return to the Soviet Union in order to rebuild Yiddish culture through communism, whereas the German Jews on whom I concentrate can neither remain in Germany at the end of the Weimar Republic, for obvious reasons, nor can they adopt anything other than a provisional understanding of home, because as melancholics, they had lost both a physical location for home and faith in the concept of home as such. The melancholia that motivates the ideological choices of these figures also characterizes the fate of many of them. Walter Benjamin commits suicide while fleeing the Nazis from France to Spain in 1940. Joseph Roth, who died from the effects of acute alcoholism even before World War II had begun, might as well be considered a suicide. Moisha Kolbach, like most of the Yiddish cultural activists in Soviet Minsk, was a victim of the Great Purge of the late 1930s. Nister and Bergelson, who unlike Kulbak became committed activists in the Soviet Union, achieved international prominence during World War II as members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, invested with the task of promoting the Soviet war effort among Jews abroad. Because of their association with American Jewish leaders, as well as the enthusiasm of many Jews in the Soviet Union for the State of Israel, by 1948, the now disbanded committee was accused of treason. Not in spite, but because of their importance to the state and the party, they were tried, convicted, tortured, and killed by the government they had served. Although I could not know it when I began researching this comparison, the world today faces some of the same threats that destroyed the Weimar Republic. Eastern Europe, and Russia in particular, are being drawn into a widening gyre of authoritarianism, intolerance, and corruption. Europe generally seems in danger of dissolving into ever more fractious, xenophobic nation states, and paradoxically, The more localized nationalist movements in places such as Spain, the United Kingdom, maybe even Belgium, suggest more durable democratic models than the federated yet increasingly isolationist nation states from which they would secede. The United States and Israel are less immune to these dangers than could have been imagined a decade ago. In the face of these hazards, including the risks posed by acquiescence, passivity, and despair, the culture of Weimar Germany offers a cautionary lesson and several individual models for the pursuit of freedom, the dignity of the individual, and the value of community. Many of the figures in this comparison can be said to have given their life for these values, less as conscious martyrs than as sacrificial victims. One should not romanticize the condition of the cosmopolitans, however much each of them was prone to romanticize himself. Rather, the displacement each suffered and the tragedy that befell so many of them serve as a moral obligation to each citizen and every nation, to provide a home to the homeless, a refuge to the refugee, not because nature recognizes some people as natives and others as transients, but because the lesson of history, the lesson of eminence, the lesson of allegory, calls continuously to mind the fact that on a planet eternally in motion, all homes are forever fleeting. The authors and artists in this study attest to the historical complexity, social significance, and formal brilliance of aesthetic modernism. By understanding the philosophical motivations for their aesthetic choices, the meaning of these works can be understood in ethical terms as well as formal ones. Every work in this study rewards an engagement with its difficulties, its ambiguities, and its eloquence. It is hoped that their juxtaposition in my work will also reward the patience of its readers with new insights into literary form, Jewish culture, and the continuities, whether as menace or promise, between Weimar and now. Thank you.